I want to bring in former FBI General Counsel and former senior member of Mueller probe and MSNBC legal analyst Andrew Weissmann, who has been inside the overflow room. Duncan Levin, Chuck Rosenberg, still with us. Okay, Andrew, we have gone over this pretty thoroughly. And if there is one thing that we heard over and over and over again, it's he lied. He's a liar. He's not to be trusted. He's the MVP of liars. Gloat, the greatest liar of all time. What did you make of that emphasis of the argument? And did he score at all, do you think?
Well, I think for folks like Chuck and me, where we've heard a lot of prosecution and defense arguments in our lifetime, this was a fairly standard defense summation where you have sort of an amalgam of some catchy lines like the gloat line and the MVP line. You have some inconsistent arguments. You have some make-weight arguments that really don't hold up if you sort of even begin to scratch the surface. And then you have some legitimate arguments, which the defense, where the state is really going to need to respond, but they're about to, right after lunch, have that opportunity. So it was a real grab bag. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way. The defense has an obligation to try and see if they can find at least one juror who will bite on any of those presentations. So they're really offering an array of things. But I have to say, as somebody who's pretty jaded and listening to these things, just saying Michael Cohen is a liar didn't really do a lot for me. Everyone knew that going in. Everyone knew that from his direct and his cross. So that's not really the issue. The issue is, can he be corroborated enough, or is there enough independent evidence? And I really feel like the defense really failed to make certain key arguments about why Michael Cohen and Alan Weisselberg would have ever kept this scheme from Donald Trump. I think that to me is still the key issue in the case, as well as Exhibits 35 and 36, just to be in the weeds, which are the handwritten notes that detail the scheme. And those two issues were really not addressed by Todd Blanche. I'm not faulting him. I'm not sure what he could say, but he really didn't address either of those two things. And that's where I think if you are actually thinking logically about what you heard, it left a big hole in the defense case.
Stylistically, do you want to talk about that? Because we all know that when you're going to talk for hours, you need to be able to be the person who engages. The one consistent thing that we read in the document was that he would raise his voice when he would call him a liar or make another disparaging remark. But did you find him to be compelling?
That's a great question. So one, there was actually a fair amount of sort of decorum in the courtroom until about the last half hour or so, where Todd really focused on Michael Cohen and understandably, when he was saying he's a liar, raised his voice and tried to use with his body language and his inflection, try and get the jury more engaged. So that was understandable, but it was notably absent before that. And he was, I think, in trying to engage in sort of rational discussion and going over the facts. I actually think with a jury, that is actually a better way to sort of focus on the case. In terms of style, it wasn't my cup of tea, but I'm not on the jury. I've always wondered why Todd Blanche was taking such a prominent role when Susan Necheles is such a more experienced defense lawyer, and I've seen her in action in court in other cases, and to me it was just notable that she was, in my view, sort of underutilized. But Todd did a perfectly acceptable job. I'm not sure I would say it was compelling, at least to me. But again, the job of the jurors is to try and leave all of that theater aside, understanding there's always a part of the presentation that is theater, and you do have to be compelling when you're speaking for about 3 hours. But I thought on his arguments, that the ones, if you sift through the ones that I thought had more meat to them, I thought he made those well.
Andrew, can I ask you about what happened right before the lunch break for the lawyers and the judge, at least? This is the judge reprimanding Todd Blanche for talking about sending a man to prison and having the jury think twice about that. Steinglass objected. Can you tell us about what that sounded like?
Sure. I mean, that happens quite a bit in defense summations, where defense lawyers will just try to, essentially ring a bell that can't be unheard. So essentially, that's the reason they talk about jail is so that jurors are thinking about what kind of punishment would be imposed based on their verdict, and that is not a proper consideration for the jury. And so that's, I assume, why Todd did that. It is something that I've seen other defense lawyers do. It is inappropriate, and that objection was sustained. I should say that Judge Merchan was very I think, favorable to Trump in terms of there were a number of objections that were not sustained. They were overruled. And so I continue to think that Judge Merchan continues to be really sort of almost the definition of fairness and judicial temperament in the way he handled the summation today. We'll see that he'll have the same on his hands with the prosecution summation, and you should expect various objections by Todd Blanche, because it's a way, remember, Todd doesn't get to do a rebuttal, so by objecting, I would expect that we're going to hear those objections as a way to try and remind the jurors that Todd may have a response to what is being said. So it may be a bit of a bumpy afternoon.
And Andrew, when you're the prosecution, what kind of, do you change your closing? Obviously, in some parts you do. But do you change the way you open to try to deal with some of these problems right up front, some of the things that the defense brought up?
In some circumstances, you would. But, Andrea, the one thing, again, I think this comes from, Chuck and I have heard so many of these types of arguments. The one thing I was struck by, there was nothing that I heard that was sort of unexpected or unplanned for. And so I just don't expect that this is going to throw Josh Steinglass, who's extremely experienced. He's done far more jury addresses than I ever have. So I don't think he'll be changing anything. But of course, he will have a section of his summation that will deal with all of the key arguments that were made by Todd Blanche this morning.
And in terms of the last issue that Katie brought up, which is talking about sentencing, which was clearly inappropriate, and the possibility of sending a former president to prison, will the judge jump in there and try to do some sort of a curative instruction to the jury, or will he wait for his jury instructions?
Yep. So, great question. I don't think he certainly, when I was there, he did not jump in. I don't expect, just given Judge Merchan, that he will say something before the prosecution summation. But we have not seen the final charge that he has handed out to the parties. And if it is not in there, I would expect that the state would ask for a typical charge that is given, which is to tell the jury that they are not to concern themselves in any way with sentencing or what may happen if he is convicted. They are solely to decide the facts and whether the state proved its case beyond a reasonable doubt.
Because, Andrew, he seemed annoyed, certainly in the language. We were just reading text, but he was saying, I can't believe that was an accident. You know better. You're an experienced prosecutor with all of your years, paraphrasing, but he really chewed him out.
Right. Yeah, well, it's just to be clear, that's not a mistake. I mean, he's totally right. It is not a mistake. Todd, like the other two defense lawyers, is experienced, even if he is more experienced on the prosecution side than the defense side. But I have also more experience on the prosecution and the defense side. And you know what? We all know you cannot talk about sentencing. So, of course, it was deliberate, and he deserved the tongue lashing. And you know what? I think if you were to ask Todd Blanche right now, did he expect that that's what was going to happen? He would have said, yes, I understood that, this is what the consequences are. So it's not something you should do. He was appropriately chastised by the judge. I do expect, Andrea, that if it is not in the final charge that the judge gives right now, that is something that I think the judge will add to make sure that it is not something that the jury considers. But as we all know, the whole point of this is once you've rung that bell, you can't unring it.